Hello and welcome in to Divided We Fail, a political front porch chat podcast. We have been a little to and fro because it's the holidays, and we were thankful for our beautiful country and for Matt Eberflus being completely incapable of clock management. Shout out to Bears fans. Moving on, we are talking about education today. We have our typical tandem trio, me, Cody, James. Gentlemen, please say hello.
Hello.
How's everyone doing?
Jesus. James, we've been doing a podcast for almost 2 years now, and you still can't get past hello?
I'll work on it.
Anyways, we do have a special guest, somebody near and dear to my heart, because it is our education episode.
See what you did there.
I believe I have expressed on multiple occasions that my darling wife is an educator, so she is here to help us make sense of something that we know very little about, because none of us are educators. So, Chelsea, if you would like to say hello.
Hey.
It's a little tradition here for people to get to hear a little bit about you, your background, kind of what you do, why you do it. So I'm going to give you the floor if you want to just for preferences, or just for, not preferences, but just for examples. All of us basically talked about like our upbringing real quickly, and then like what we do for a living, so they don't have to stress out about like giving us like a long story. But go ahead and tell us.
My upbringing?
Well, like
my education?
Well, like we said, we're from like small
My
towns.
childhood?
We're middle class families, like that kind of stuff.
Just the spark notes of your biography.
Yeah, exactly. How you went from conception to educator.
Well, my mother and my father love each other so much. Grew up in a small town.
Love.
What?
I said it doesn't require love anymore.
It never did.
Not anymore. But they still do love each other. Happily married.
No. I don't know what that's like. Oh.
Anyways, it's Chelsea's floor, James.
For my parents. Sorry, for my parents.
Do you want to talk about it?
Sorry.
Do we need a therapy session, or?
Cody's
we
on
can
the
do
clock.
that later, James. I'm not getting paid right now.
Anyway.
So, small town.
Yes, and then met my husband and moved to bigger town.
Which is crazy.
And crazy.
Like that we're a bigger town.
Right.
It
I
is,
think
well-
we all think it's a small town because it's where we grew up.
Well, the district that I worked in was bigger because it covered miles and miles. So I worked there for 6 years, and I did first grade reading intervention. And then I moved up here, and now I teach 6th grade. I did 2 years of reading, and now I'm doing science, which is super fun.
Hell yeah. And these are both public schools?
Both public.
Both public schools? Both publicly funded? Vastly different pools of funding, but publicly funded.
Well, yes, but I think they're both Title I schools, so.
Can you
I
explain
think the
what
school
that
I'm
is?
at now is that Title I schools is for communities with lower income students, and we get money from the federal government to have programs that help kids learn to read and have free lunch, and sometimes breakfast is included. We just have a couple extra programs that's paid for by the government.
And that comes from the Department of Education?
Sure does.
Okay, just wanted to make sure I was on the right page. Well, thank you. We have Chelsea here because, like I said previously on Start, that we are not educators, so we can have opinions. But from the onset of this podcast, we always said that we wanted to try and have people here that were, boots on the ground, experiencing what's actually going on, so we can kind of paint a better picture of the reality of the situation, because too often we are consumed by our echo chambers and never really get to hear what's actually happening. So she's going to answer some questions that we have for her about the status of American education, where we're going, where she would like to be, where we would like to be. And it's going to be a nice, friendly conversation because If not, I live with her, and it'll end badly for me. So, moving on. Which one of you two won the coin toss? Who gets to ask your question first?
Games.
Okay, Jimmy.
Give me an easy one.
An easy one?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you got to
What
warm
is
her up.
7 million divided by 3? No, I'm just kidding. Don't
I
answer
was
that.
I'm
I'm
a
gonna
not
science teacher,
say.
not a math teacher.
I'm gonna say, do you know that?
No. So let's start. Kind of feels like a softball question, but let's start with this. As a teacher, what do you hope your students walk away with at the end of each year? What impression do you hope to ingrain on them, I should say?
Well, before, when I taught reading for sixth grade specifically, obviously I wanted to harness like that love of reading because kids don't have the attention span, and they have technology in their hands all the time, so they do not read at home. So I forced them to read in school to hope that they would find something that they love. But that's really the small piece of it. It's not about grades or any really thing related to that, even though I push it really hard this year. Um, I feel like I have a different teaching philosophy than a lot of other teachers that I work with. I just want my kids to feel loved and to find a friend and to find a trusted adult because our kids don't have full families at home, especially because a lot of their families are in the military. So I find that I'm kind of putting the educational part aside for a lot of my kids to give them the space to have someone to talk to or to go to when they need something. Um, but academic wise, I really want them to just go away with some kind of strategy to answer questions or to ask questions. And I really push grit in my classroom because that's something that they're also lacking. Grit is a huge one for me. Responsibility. Um, yeah, just creating that kind of community family feel in the classroom because a lot of them need it.
And by
Now, when you
grit,
say
you
grit,
mean responsibility, like accountability.
Yes, deadlines, like they're always going to have deadlines in life. So I really push that. You're working hard, you're doing your best all the time, even if it's something small and fun.
yeah, I had that same follow-up. I just wanted to be like you mean like a never giving up
Yeah,
type of mentality.
yep.
Okay.
Like put your head down, get the work done, but feel good about it too.
Yeah. Hmm, I like that.
Yeah.
Cody, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm just trying to pick which question is going to be the best fit. Um, for a startup question. What do you think is your biggest barrier to success as a teacher?
Right now, especially with the well, I guess it could be even for first graders too. Parents are a huge struggle. Um, the way that we grew up is not the same way that kids are growing up now. And the parenting techniques are much softer. And a lot of the times when we're trying to work with kids and we bring their parents into it just to communicate about it, I feel like there's a lot of finger pointing because they think a lot of the times their kids are perfect and we need to change and adapt to meet the needs of their kids instead of the kids changing and adapting to meet the needs of school, um, which is super difficult. But not even like with parents, there's like that push and pull everywhere. Like Department of Education, for example, there's that push and pull of what do we want and what do we want to provide and what do we want to take away. It's never consistent. The consistency is key, and we don't have it anywhere. Um, Teacher prep programs in colleges are empty. There's no one going for teaching right now. But like even as teachers, we can't blame them, right? It's there's no subs. So when there's no subs, we cover classes, which takes away our teaching of our kids in our normal day. Um, it's a lot of money-based decisions as well. So colleges being expensive, so kids are going into trades instead. We don't have money to, or there's not enough money to pay a sub to come in and do that job because kids are rotten to them. It's all this push and pull between administration, government, state mandates, parents, all at once, all the time. I feel like I'm pulled in a million different directions sometimes.
Now, I'm glad that you mentioned the like the kids being rotten to teachers and stuff. I've noticed personally that there's a lot of things these kids do these days that if I would have done, and I'm sure Travis and Cody will attest to this, if we would have done anything like they're doing now, our parents would have murdered us. And I
Correct.
feel like a lot of it now is, well, my kid doesn't do any wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, do you think this is my theory on it? And I don't know because I don't actually see these parents, but I feel like a lot of that has started because of kids having kids, I guess is the way I'd put it.
Yep.
I feel like the parents are younger and younger, and they feel like it's their job to be their kid's best friend.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know if that's something you've noticed as well,
There's no
or
accountability on any end. Like kids just don't care. But I think the thing of it is they see how adults are talking to each other at home and it's not positive language. So when they come to school, they think that they can treat other people that way as well.
Well, and I think social media now more than ever really makes it, for lack of a better way to put it, cool in their eyes to treat one another with disrespect because it's what gets views.
And we had a huge problem with that. We haven't seen it yet this year. It usually happens in the springtime. Um, with kids destroying bathrooms, they'll literally pull toilet paper holders off the wall. They'll pull off the hand drying blowers, yank them off the wall, and film it and post it on TikTok or Snapchat or whatever. And
now when
they don't care.
so when it comes to that, do you think um because I'm big on there's every action has a consequence. I'm sorry, a consequence, whether it's a positive or a negative. I feel like things things like suspending kids, um, detention, I feel like that's kind of not useful anymore.
No. And
Uh,
our
and
one
depending
of
on
our
the
principals has walked away from that because they just go home and they're on a device.
yeah,
They don't
it's
actually get punished.
so what I think should be done, and this is just my personal opinion. Do you think like a police intervention type thing would be? I'm not saying cuff the kids and stuff them, but
We actually have that in our school.
oh, do you?
Yep,
Wow.
we have a officer that we share between two schools, so he can be contacted. He goes in between wherever he's needed, and a lot of the time he does the disciplining, especially when it's something like that. They're destroying property, if they're getting in fights, things like that, threats and all that. He will sit down and have a chat with them and be like, in the real life, when you're an adult, that's not going to fly. And I really think that has a positive effect on them, especially with building that rapport between the police officer and the kids. He's
Yeah, which
super
I think,
gentle about it, but firm.
and I think in today's world, that's kind of a necessary thing to
Hmm.
be have that positive interaction from a young age with cops. That way, because at the end of the day, they are to protect.
Right,
And creating a positive interaction. If they need help, they're more likely to call.
right.
Um, I think personally, I think parents should pay the restitution because at the end of the day, kids go home, and if there's no consequence at home, that message may not actually sink.
Right.
If that makes sense. And like I said,
And
it
it's
all
really
depends on age.
difficult. It's really difficult right now too because my kids are going home and they're home by themselves or they're going to an after school program because their parents have to work two jobs. So sometimes those kids are on their own and they literally don't know what to do with themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a sad reality. I mean,
It's a
especially
whole
at the end of
societal issue.
and it ties into a whole host of other issues with the economy and all that stuff.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think so. Let me ask you this. We mentioned social media, and I think a big component of social media is there's a lot more bullying,
Hmm.
and I feel, for a lack of a better term, the old heads of some families, like you look at grandma, grandpa, or even people, some people's parents because they're older. They look at the bullying as like, oh, well, I was bullied in high school and stuff, and they fail to realize the difference of when they're in school versus now. Whereas in school, like, yeah, you went home, you got away from it,
Hmm.
and now it is more of a constant thing
Yeah, 24
because
7.
it's on social media, it's on whatever. I remember back in the day when I wanted to make a phone call, I had to go do the phone, make the phone call, and I had about 10 feet worth of cord.
Hmm.
After that, there was nothing.
Yep,
So, um, do you think there's been a rise in bullying too?
for sure. Because kids can do it anonymously. They can hide behind a screen. They can make a profile without their name on it, without their picture, and no one will know who it is. And they can just say whatever they want.
Right.
And
And
a
there's
lot
no
of the times,
accountability there
right,
either.
they're coming to school and they think that they can just say things because there hasn't been a consequence for them. They're used to being behind a screen and saying whatever they want. So when it comes to saying things out loud in person, sometimes they forget and they say things out loud that they shouldn't say out loud
Well, and
because they're used to that.
I also think too, right? Like with everything that's happened in this country, at least, they'll see people have these massive platforms, whether it be a political campaign, whether it be a Spotify podcast, whether it be an interview on TV or YouTube videos or whatever. They'll see these people say these very toxic things,
Hmm.
and it, right, makes them feel emboldened. They have no one at home to contradict that message, or people at home aren't contradicting that message.
Right.
And right, you get enough of your peers to watch it and feel somewhat connected to it, it makes it
Yeah, they
easy.
gang up. Hmm. They have groups, they have group chats. They get everyone on the same page with them, and then they can just easily go after one weaker kid than them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
James, I believe it's your turn for a question there.
So, hold on, I'm skipping a question. I want to go to. Okay, so I want to go to this one because it kind of ties in. So, with the bullying and everything happening with that, there's an increased risk of active shooters and all
Hmm.
that, like school shootings and stuff, which it's a somber, no one wants to talk about it, but we're here to talk. So, with that being something that everybody now has to keep in the back of their head, when it comes to school shootings and all that, would you as a teacher feel safer if there was teachers who were armed, if they were trained? I want to specifically say that. If they were trained and willing to carry, would that make you feel more safe or comfortable as a teacher?
Personally, I wouldn't feel safe with teachers with weapons because I wouldn't trust myself and I wouldn't trust these kids. And there's just so many things in my head that could go wrong rather than going right. So we have an armed officer, and a lot of the time he's at that front entrance, he's walking the halls. We have someone watching cameras almost all the time. So that's what makes me feel safe. Um, Personally, I wouldn't put guns in hands of teachers, I don't think. There's just too many things that could go wrong. That would make me nervous.
I have
That's
a
fair.
very
I just
specific example I want to ask about guns. How do you feel about off-duty officers carrying when they come to one of their kids' events, whether it be like a breakfast, a concert, whatever?
I think, I don't know. I'm back and forth on it. An off duty officer is much different than someone who just went and got their pistol permit, you know?
Oh yeah,
So, an
I
off
don't disagree with
duty officer, I would feel much better about than someone off the street who just went and took that course,
you. Yeah.
I
personally.
just want to clarify when I asked about that, I meant specifically trained. So
Right.
instead of doing like, instead of Mr. Franklin down the street who's like, I want to carry my gun. I mean, an extensive amount of classes with New York State PD. I don't think random teachers carrying a gun into school is necessarily a good idea.
Hmm.
But if there's teachers who are willing, I think it could be beneficial. Obviously, don't take it out and show the class. Like,
Right.
but like if so I'm thinking of like a local district um where it's a small town, but it's like a majority of the teachers probably hunt. They've been using weapons their whole lives, stuff like that.
Hmm.
I think could be a net benefit. Um, and if so,
No.
I think that because I look at schools, right? Schools are gun-free zones. I don't know if it's just in New York State, but most places are gun-free zones. It creates a soft target, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So you look at it as there's going to be no return fire.
We're more vulnerable.
Yeah. And I
Hmm.
think, and I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm just
No,
explaining why
no.
I think,
Yep.
um, I think knowing that there's a chance there's going to be return fire might stop some of it. Granted, most of the school shooters end up dead anyways.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I think that's intentional.
Yep.
But I'm thinking if we could, because no matter where you are, police response isn't immediate.
Hmm.
And in a situation like that, if there is someone there who's well trained, I'm not talking just went and got their pistol permit. I'm talking went through the pistol permit, has been trained by state PD, has been trained by XYZ. Um, I think it could be a net benefit, but that's just my belief. I'm not a teacher or anything. But
My mind goes back and forth on it because personally, I'm not super pro gun, but being
yep,
in a school, I've been in multiple schools now where we've had armed officers. and that's his main job, is to keep us safe. That makes me feel much more safe than it would if I think teachers had guns. I
Right.
think that schools should hire those SBO officers to
Well, and
have all the time.
I think having an armed officer is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
I think more people carrying guns in schools isn't great because you're just increasing access and exposure to weapons. It doesn't necessarily help. Not that those people wouldn't be trained to keep it on them, but the example I gave, my kid is in school. There was an uh, civilian plainclothes officer who brought his uh, service weapon in with him to a pancake breakfast
Hmm.
in the school cafeteria with 35 kids running around him. And I know it's not easy to take a gun out of a holster. And at the same time, just why? Right? There's no need for it. I hear your comment about it being a vulnerable target, James, and I think schools are a vulnerable target not because they're unarmed, but because the trauma and other things that ensue in schools that isn't well managed. Not necessarily by teachers, right? Because as a teacher, there's only so much you can do,
Hmm.
right? Like you cannot be responsible for every kid's mental well being, but through a lack of resources, a lack of funding, and a lack of support for teachers and students, I think why it is so vulnerable is because it is a place of a lot of trauma for kids.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think managing that solves the gun problem without adding more guns.
And there's a huge liability piece there too. Like, God forbid that teacher panics under pressure and something happens to the kids anyways.
Well, and
Like,
certainly, I don't think if you're going to add more armed officers in a school, any of them should be teachers.
hmm.
Because, right, then you're developing a different kind of relationship with those kids where it gives you an opportunity to play favorites and learn more about beliefs and other things. So
Hmm.
it makes it so much easier to be biased.
Right. I think the biggest thing to take out of the whole mass shooting and school situation, we have to start at mental health. Um, it's an epidemic in our country, and we really have to hone in on that in order to start to fix anything.
I'm not gonna lie, I feel 95% of the issues in this country, mental health reform could change a lot of it.
Hmm.
A lot of the problems we face, whether it's drugs, suicide, I mean, there's a whole laundry list of things. I think we plan on doing a mental health reform episode.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, I mean, that's the tip of the iceberg when it comes to it. You know, there's so much mental health issues in this country that we have to find ways to be more proactive. And as a teacher, it's got to be extremely difficult on them, anyways, because you figure you get the students from what 7:30 to 2:30
Yeah. Yep.
typical day.
Just about.
So you're talking 6 hours with these kids.
Hmm.
You know, that's 35 hours in a week. That's less than a parent's working a full-time job.
Hmm.
So you have the whatever teachers teachers don't have the ability to solve all these problems because that you it all translates back to the parents have to be present too.
Hmm.
And I think there's a multitude of reasons why parents aren't in schools and aren't home. Um,
Right.
so we when this stuff happens, we look at it as, well, why didn't the teacher say anything? Why didn't the students, why weren't the students being held accountable and all this other stuff? And I think a lot of that comes down to the school districts themselves need to do a better job.
Mhm.
Not necessarily on the teacher front, but above, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Like in terms of having punishment for the actions.
Yep.
Um, and parents need to be around more. And how we
Yeah,
get
we
there,
have
I don't know.
there's a ton of parents that I've met with that are on top of their kids and they're pushing them and doing incredible jobs and those kids make a difference. And then we have kids who just keep falling farther and farther behind. And there's a study that shows that a kid needs to have 3 good years of school in a row in order to be like successful in life and in school and college and all that later on in life. And there's so many factors that take away from that now that kids aren't getting those 3 years.
Right. And I think like some of the things that would help those kids have more access to parents at home, and I'm not saying it would solve the problem, but I know it would certainly help, is imagine if parents didn't have to pay for health insurance or didn't have to pay for child care and that was just
Mhm.
something you got for paying taxes.
Mhm.
How less stressed they'd be because they wouldn't be having to coordinate things. It would be, no, you get childcare for paying your taxes. Here's the places you can go in your area, and never having to play hopscotch with childcare or figure out, oh, this place closed, this can't. There would, all of that would be set in place.
Right.
And then
It would take a lot of stress off of them.
not having to necessarily work right. If one parent had a really well paying job that didn't provide health insurance and another parent had a job that maybe paid only like $35,000, $40,000, I don't know what minimum wage would top out at, but had good health insurance, you're kind of forced to work a full-time job just for
Mhm.
something that really varies based on any given decision any day, either in the government or with an employer.
Mhm. We can only do so much as teachers, as parents, as even kids. Like we all tap out somewhere and we have to close some doors in order for those positive good ones to open.
Speaking of that, I have a two-part question. What do you think what do you think were some of the main impacts of the pandemic on kids and teachers?
So when I was doing first grade, I was teaching during COVID, doing the whole remote thing, Google Meets. Some days kids were in school and I was teaching them in school, and the next day they were home and I was teaching them on a computer. I was right in the thick of it. And the kids who showed up were the kids who were already super intelligent and invested in school because their parents were invested in school. They had the technology at home. Um, their parents had the ability with their jobs to stay home with them and make sure that they did their schoolwork. And those kids that I had who were behind in reading never showed up because of access, because of parents not being there to help them. Um, we saw that right from the get go, and that just kept on rolling even through now. Like, I have kids who are reading at first, second, third grade levels in sixth grade. It was super difficult to teach reading, writing, math virtually, especially in elementary school. So we've really fallen behind academically in that way. There's also a lot of really funny, quirky things that kids do. Like whenever they're doing assignments on their Chromebook and they have headphones on or whatever, they think that it's almost like they think they are muted and they're just
Mm,
making all of these random noises all the time. And it just, imagine a class of 20 kids and eight of them are just constantly making noise while I'm trying to teach something.
yeah.
It's incredibly frustrating, but it's just one of those little quirky things that came along with it.
Well, I
Um,
imagine some degree of social delay impacts that.
mhm.
'Cause it's really about self-awareness and perception.
And some classes come in and they're really mature and they're almost too old for their age. That was last year's class that I had. They're in seventh grade now. They're almost too, they know too much. Whereas the class we got this year, they would have been in, let's see, 4 years ago, it was like first grade, second grade during the
Mhm.
pandemic.
Yeah.
And they are very immature and young for their age. So there's
Yeah.
like this split depending on what grade they were in during that time and how they
Mhm.
act at school.
Yeah. And then the second part of my question, which opens up a whole bigger door. Um, what are what are your expectations of administration, and what do you feel administration typically expects of teachers? And then how do you feel you could feel more supported by administration?
So the big thing is administration right now is dealing with so much behavior that they're really missing out on the core school things. I love an administrator who is visible and can walk around that school. They can walk into your classroom at any time and you feel comfortable with them sitting down, hanging out with your kids, and doing whatever you're doing. But that gets missed a lot. They don't have time. They don't leave their office because they're dealing with, again, they're making parent phone calls. They're dealing with kids misbehaving constantly. Even though some schools have two, three administrators, they're all bogged down with things that they have to do that takes them away from the actual learning. Um, so when we do our observations, they have to come in and see us teach a lesson. Sometimes it feels like we have to put on a show because they don't see what we do in our normal everyday life. We have to pack so much into a lesson so that we can meet criteria on a rubric because they don't get to see what we do every day. That's one of my biggest things with administration. Um, it's just they push all of these things that they want us to do, but then never come in to see us actually doing them, which gets really frustrating.
When I imagine that doesn't leave a lot of time for them to ask what you need to be able to do the things either.
Right. Which I think a lot of people aren't afraid to ask for things. So it's a lot of asking and asking and asking, and I'm giving and giving,
Right.
which sometimes they can only give so much, you know? But
Right.
there's a
You
lot of great administrators out there. Like, um, I came in and my furniture in my room was all mismatched. I had tables from here and there, and they weren't doing furniture requests and paying for furniture for classrooms last year. But my principal still put that in for me. And that is just something that made me feel seen.
Mhm.
I think teachers just want to feel seen by their higher ups.
Yeah, there's a lot of disconnect usually is what it sounds like from what I've
Mm-hmm.
heard from people I
Yeah.
know. And
And there's like a certain amount of time and years usually that an administrator can have a positive interaction before then it starts turning negative because they're stressed too. They have a lot on their plates. It's all a domino effect. It comes from the superintendent and the school board onto them. They have to push things, which teachers, a lot of the time, it's things that teachers don't like and they don't have time to do or they don't want to do, which gets pushed back on them. And it's hard on them a lot of the time. They have super stressful jobs, and Trav asks me all the time if I would want to be a principal, and I say absolutely not. Like, bow down to them. That is great that you're doing that, but I will stay in my classroom and teach till I'm old. Thank you.
I have a
Um.
question for you. Yep, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna ask to if Well, it's a two-part question. One is, what are some ways that you think the influence of both state and federal government like help in ways that you're hindered? Like, where does it get in the way? Where do you think you need more help? Can't
In federal government,
both.
so there's different levels of help that we get from literally everywhere. State government runs most of our criteria, our curriculums usually go through state. Common Core is more federally based, but state curriculums have taken Common Core and made their own curriculums. Um, can you repeat your question again?
Um,
I totally lost.
it's all right. It
Oh,
just
where we need more help?
where you need help and where there's like kind of overreach.
Um, a lot of what teachers want to do is just teach, but there's so many other things that we have to push, like standardized testing, or in New York State, we have Regents exams that we have to prep kids for. And a lot of the time, we feel like we're doing so much testing and data points that we don't get to have a lot of time to authentically teach. So it would be nice to have a pullback on that in some ways, but I still think that schools and teachers and students have to be held accountable somewhere to make sure that we are reaching where they're supposed to be in reading and math, especially.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the good things that come from it is we have the regulations for example, like kids with disabilities. Um, their IEPs, their 504 plans are federally mandated, state mandated. We have to follow them. And I think that is incredible thing that um, they can oversee for us. Because if that was taken away, um, Trav and I were talking about our nephew has spina bifida. If he wasn't federally mandated to get the programs and the accessibility features at his school, if that was all taken away, he could just be totally overlooked and unsuccessful in school.
Well, I'm like some teachers would still provide him some of those things, right? Because there are really good teachers who go above and beyond without a 504 or an IEP,
For sure. But
and
those
their resources would be so limited.
mhm,
Right, like with
those IEPs and 504s keep us all on track. We have meetings about it. We make sure those kids have the supplies they need, anything they might need, a special computer or whatever.
right,
Those make it so that we can get funding for that.
right, and with Grayson, like he's cognitively there is no issue. He's incredibly brilliant, but he still needs to have like diaper changes and things like that, and have his cath. So like those are services that would be provided for under those plans. That if they were
Yeah.
gone, they would be eliminated.
Yes.
So, fun fact to go with that while we're on the topic of federal and state provisions to school from fiscalpolicy.org. Federal funding for New York State schools specifically was about 4% for most local schools across the state.
Was 4%
Federal funding was 4%.
of like the school's budget?
Right.
Yeah, that's
The other 96 was state funding.
right, and that's why I think the idea of eliminating the Department of Education is laughable because they provide services like she just talked about with IEP protections, disenfranchised kids. Like they don't do like people think that the federal government's coming down and telling your kids to like, learn to be gay, and that's not what's happening.
Right. Well, and that's to give the example that like states like New York would be significantly less impacted than other states
Right.
where it's closer to 50%
Right. And
that their federal government gives in funds to those schools
that's what some people want,
as
man.
opposed to the 4%. I'm aware that's what some people want, but right, if you cut the Department of Education federally, you're limiting access to resources, maybe even access to whole schools would
For
shut down.
a shit ton of southern rural poor kids.
Right.
Um, not to veer off course here, but I know I brought it up, and Chelsea and I had briefly talked about it. Um, I want to put the kibosh on some misnomers and some rumors that exist from people outside of education. Chelsea, why don't you give us your experience with gender ideology and identity and its impact on your daily life?
You want to know like transgender and all that?
Well, I think you specifically said to me that it's virtually a non-issue.
Yeah, there's like this whole. I'm only speaking from the three schools that I've worked at in New York State. But there's this idea that we are teaching kids, um, encouraging them to be gay or encouraging them to switch genders. And this whole talk around female and male, and they think that that's being talked about in school, whereas like not even something on my radar. Um, I talk about it with my kids the same that I've talked about it for the last 10 years of teaching. It's okay if girls want to play with trucks and boys want to play with dolls. That's their choice, and that's the end of it. We had a transgender, we have one currently, and um, the parents, I don't think we're fully on board yet, but we
Mm.
have an incredible counseling office, and they said, hey, you guys have this kid. He now wants to be called this name from female to male. And we're like, cool, great. We called that kid's name that they preferred, and it wasn't even an issue. So there's this whole argument over it in the news and on social media. Whereas if you came into a school, it wouldn't even be something that you saw or even noticed. End of rant.
Hey, that's why I wanted you to say it because there's a significant chunk of both sides of the political talking head zeitgeist that think that this is like a major pressing issue, and it's just not. Each of them cherry pick um, really rare occurrences to spin a narrative that just doesn't exist on the grand scale of education. And so I just wanted you to be able to say your piece there.
Well, and
For
it's also not
example, sorry, go ahead.
it's not like those kids are gaining a mass social network and convincing all their friends to do the same thing. Most of the kids who are either gender fluid, non binary, trans, or just gay or queer in any way are typically some of the shyer, quieter, more anxious kids. And they're
Hmm.
certainly not making friends with everyone and getting everyone to join a cult.
For sure. Like, I had a kid, they were reading a book, and one of the characters was questioned if they were gay or something, or their sister was gay. And they were reading in a circle, and a kid piped up and said, hey, I'm actually think I'm bisexual. And the kids were like, cool. And they kept reading. Like it wasn't even an issue.
Right.
And kids are just adapted to that too.
Right. And the less you stigmatize it, the less it becomes a big thing.
The
And
issue is with adults, it's not with the kids. Like
right.
you wouldn't even believe the amount of people who asked me and believed that there were litter boxes in schools for
Oh,
furries.
it's my least favorite of all the things.
That's fucking
I was
And
like,
crazy.
that's not happening anywhere. that I know of.
Right. And to clarify my previous statement, being queer is not cult like, but I think that is oftentimes the depiction is they make it seem like it is like this mass following or cult
Like they're
like event
pushing it.
when it's not.
Yeah.
Whose turn is it to ask a question? I forgot.
James was asking a question before I shut him up.
Oh.
Oh, all right. I think I have it.
All right.
So going back to when you mentioned administrators and stuff and how they're struggling and pretty much everybody's struggling in the school, where do you rank on a scale of 1 to 10 the importance of your administrators to have done the job before?
Oh, super high. Like 7 or above. It's so much easier for an administrator to have been in our shoes before they become a principal. They're so much more successful, I think. It's super high. I would say
That wasn't
averaging
on those
around
two
an 8.
questions, but when you mentioned it, I thought of it because I'm a big fan or a big proponent of in order to tell people how to do the job and what to do in their job, you have to have done it before.
I agree. There's a lot more empathy that comes with that.
And there's a lot more like trade knowledge and technical understanding of things that
Hmm.
fits that relationship.
Yes.
And I think that's exactly what James is driving at.
Yeah, I
It,
just think it's much more practical for you to set expectations when you have already done the job because I've worked for employers before who have expected a job to take a certain amount of time, never having done the job, and then they're questioning you and coming down on you saying, "Well, why is it taking this long? Why is it taking this long?" And I'm like, "Have you done this? Like this there's a process to it. If you want to do it right and do it effectively, this is how you have to do things."
right.
Right.
And
It's
I
The
like
think
best
trying
that
to
just
say,
creates
superintendents, sorry, we all started talking at once there.
you're good. Go
No,
ahead.
you're good,
The
go ahead.
best superintendents that I know have been teachers before, and they were teachers for years.
Yeah. And what I was going to say is it's like trying to build anything yourself, right? Like any DIY project, whether it be putting together a garage door opener or putting on a smart lock and trying to figure out, oh, how long is it going to take me to do this? And you Google it. It's like, oh, yeah, it'll take like 2 to 3 hours. For the average professional to do it, yes, it takes 2 to 3 hours.
Right.
Um, one thing that I was just reading through the questions that they had pre-sent for you to prep for, and we got a little bit into it, but I wanted to give James a chance to just kind of talk and ask from his perspective. So James, I'll give you the floor, but you had mentioned in the group chat that you wanted to ask about like the pipeline for special education students when it comes to getting through school and kind of how I read it as you think they just kind of pushed out the door. So I can give you the floor on that if you'd like.
I wouldn't say necessarily pushed out the door. Um, I think so. I work with people with disabilities, that was mentioned before.
Hmm.
And I've noticed and I've heard from parents that a lot of their school was sitting down and doing math problems or teaching them general education things like, math and this and that. But there wasn't really much of a life skill taught to them. They weren't taught
Hmm.
how to properly deal with their emotions, how to
Right.
spell their name. A lot of it was left out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I planned on talking to a special ed teacher about it because I wanted to get their insight on it. But as a teacher, I don't know if you see special ed department. I know in my high school they were kept off in the back corner and no one really knew about it until
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know about it until my senior year. Do you think that when preparing not even just people with disabilities, but people in general, there should be more real life preparation that goes into schooling?
So for the special ed part of it, I am a huge pusher on, I'm a huge believer on, sure, they need some academic things, like it would help if they learn to read and write and do simple math. But then to keep going into algebra and all of that isn't going to help them in later life. We know that. So I think at that point in their schooling, it should really switch over to life skills. And there's a lot of schools that do that really well. They'll start with the kids in elementary school. A lot of the time, it's a 12-1-1 classroom or a 12-1-3-1, where it's a smaller class. But legally, we are supposed to have the least restrictive environment for those kids, which means they are in a classroom where they can be successful at their level, even with their disability. So a lot of kids will start out in a whole classroom and then even before they're identified and get super frustrated. Kindergarten, first grade, they're already frustrated with school because that's too hard for them. And I think that's kind of where it starts for a lot of those kids. They get frustrated, they don't want anything to do with school. So then what would be their least restrictive environment turns into that classroom that we see that's the door is closed all the time and it has all of those kids with the disabilities in it. And they're doing their best to teach the curriculum. But I think, and if Shannon were here, I know Shannon does, I think third, fourth, fifth age kids special ed. She does academics when she pushes into classrooms, but a lot of the time when she has her kids in her classroom, she's doing resource stuff, they're doing real life stuff. Um, they're learning how to communicate with each other and play with each other and gain those strategies so that they can be successful. I can't speak personally to what happens after middle school. I know at my school we have that special ed classroom, and those kids will push into the core classes a lot of the time just to interact with all the other kids, learn to work in teams, and get a little bit of the curriculum. Um, our BOCES kids will do that too, but a lot of the time that is a classroom where all hell can break loose. Like today, there was a kid who was having a rough day, and none of those kids were going to be able to learn with that kid in the classroom. So I think it's really difficult sometimes to have the staffing and then to meet every need of every kid in those classrooms because I think they do sometimes get pushed off into them without having much of a chance in other classrooms, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. They need to be, I think there needs to be an integration
Mm-hmm.
personally. My personal experience is when I was in high school, there was one special needs kid. Everybody was nice to him. He always came down the hallway. It wasn't anything like no one was malicious towards him. But that before getting into the field I'm in, that mixed with one of my good friend's brothers being autistic was really the only interaction I have had with people with
Mm-hmm.
disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got into my field and I was like, holy crap, there's so much going on. And
Mhm.
I think we're still, as a country, learning how to be more accepting of people with disabilities. If you look
Absolutely.
back, they were institutionalized not even 30 years ago.
Mhm.
Actually, oh, it's 2024 now. So it's not even 40 years ago. They were completely institutionalized. So I think there needs to be a reform on that front of while integrating them into classes for that socialization, there needs to be more of a specific curriculum for after what
Right.
happens after high school. Because I know, I don't know the exact number, but quite a few don't even end up with high school diplomas anyways.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm not saying none of them are able to, but we, I feel like the focus for education should be on what happens after school. Um, I know a gentleman with autism who's in college right now and doing great things, and he was part of core classes and stuff like that. So that was never like an issue for him. But
Mhm.
then I've worked with people who come out of high school and have no social skills, no anything. Like you speak to them and it causes anger.
Mhm.
So I look at it and it's frustrating for me because my job is to support them in any way they need. And a lot of that hinders my job because the socialization can't be there. If you go to speak, you get hit.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And, you know, and the parents have told me, well, we didn't think him sitting at school doing a worksheet was going to be the best thing for him going forward, which wholeheartedly agree. I don't
Mhm.
think doing a worksheet should be considered school.
Right.
Um, there needs to be that education level of not even just educating based on what the books say or what the curriculum says, but based on actual life.
Right.
And I think that's even in high school with your atypical kids. Um, coming out of high school, I just thought you could sign up for a credit card, you could borrow money and pay it back. They never told me interest rates this, interest rates that. They didn't tell me
Mhm.
how credit works, like your credit
Mhm.
score works. Like, I feel like it's not just an all around, or it's not just a specific thing, it's an all around thing where education is important. That's great. But I would have much rather have known that how to do taxes, how to do XYZ things that you have to do as an adult more than how to solve for X, if that makes sense.
Right. And there's schools that are doing that. Where I went to high school, I took a financial math class, so I learned how um, to calculate with interest rates in buying a house, in principal and interest and all of that. But also, we had to take an economics class for half a year, and the teacher who built this course built it so that it was full real life all the time. So we had to do a job interview with him, and we got a class job. We were paid for the job that we did in class, which then each week we had to pay rent. We went online and learned how to look at cars and save for a car payment, and we had to pay a car payment. We did taxes on paper, old school. We bought imaginary stocks and followed the stock market. So I don't think that's super difficult to even integrate in schools. There just has to be um, more of that push in the passion for it, because the teacher who built it was super passionate about it and it was super successful.
Well, and
Um,
I think with that too, there has to be more resources. There has to be more teachers because teachers are burnt out. And
mhm,
I'm going to preface my next statement because it's not a terribly popular opinion. There would have to be a lot of things that would make the circumstances for this the right circumstances, like teachers being paid more money and it maybe even having more administrators or something else. Even if school was more than 10 months a year,
mhm,
right? And I'm not saying you have to do the full 12. That is not what I'm saying. And I know what I'm saying is not a very popular opinion. Most teachers would probably punch me in the throat for saying it. And I understand.
there's ways to do it.
There are ways to do it where the teachers are treated well with dignity and their needs matter and they're adequately compensated so they're not so frustrated or angry or other things,
Uh-huh,
right? And part of the reason that wouldn't work is because there's not enough people going into the career, which means there's also not enough substitute teachers.
right.
But I think to implement more of that stuff, because I don't think there's necessarily anything that's being taught in schools that isn't useful. I just think
Mhm,
the schedule is limited and there is an opportunity for, like, there are plenty of kids who opt for what's easy. There are plenty of kids who do all the things they're told they need to do to have the best shot at getting a full ride in college because money's tight and they don't take the things they're interested in either.
uh-huh. Um, we were talking about amongst my team of teachers doing full year school, and like after every marking period or whatever, you would have 2 weeks off to rest and refresh. And we even talked about, well, what about a 4 day work and school week where we would either have Friday or Monday off? And we
Mhm.
talked about how much more we think we could get done in 4 days rather than five. Like there's
Yeah.
so many ways that we could implement that, but we would have to have adults convinced and on board in order to do that without the pushback.
Well, and part of the pushback would be childcare, so you would have to do some form of universal childcare for those people who
Hmm.
need that fifth day of school,
Right.
or the whole country just has to go to a 4 day work week.
Yeah.
Whatever you
Hey,
do.
sign me up.
I knew that wasn't going
I
to be an
think
unpopular opinion.
All right.
And the whole thing, oh,
Oh no, you're
sorry.
good. Go ahead. You're good. Totally yours.
And we were talking about these kids needing life skills. The whole problem is we don't have the staff to have life skill courses. Like we have our special ed teachers in our classroom, which is usually two teachers and an aide with however many kids they pack into one room, trying to manage all disabilities and behaviors all at once, where they don't have the ability to safely go into cooking a lunch and hosting a lunch or doing things like that. Um, where I went to high school, they did have a life skills course, and those kids were able to stay in school, I think, until they were 21 and stay and do those life skills courses. But there was the staff and the money for it. It was prioritized in that district, whereas in other districts, it's just not. There's not that money to go around.
Yeah.
All right.
All
Well,
on.
we are coming up on a little over an hour, so if you guys have any last questions you'd like to ask them now or forever hold your peace.
joke's on you because I have your phone number. I can just text you and
That's fair.
have you ask her. Um, no, so I have technically a three-part question.
Oh boy.
So it Don't worry, nothing crazy. If I were a government official and I came to you and I said, all right, I'm going to help teachers, what is the first thing you need me to do? What would that be?
You want to give me like a bonus or something? That would be cool. Give me a check. Uh, I think the first thing that we need to push is safety and mental health in school because there are those hierarchy of needs. And in order for kids to learn, those basic needs need to be met for kids, and they are not in a lot of cases. Food, shelter, um, and safety are huge for those kids. I think that we need bigger programs and mandates to push safety inside of school and outside of school, as well as their mental health, because mental health is a huge block when it comes to teaching kids to do anything. If they are not mentally there and open and ready, they are not taking any information because they just can't. Their brain is already too full. Their mind
Right.
is racing. They are just worried about surviving that day.
And to back you up on that, schools need to have these resources, but not just subcontract and have them in the school, right? Because when you do
Mhm.
it that way, like the district my kid goes to has mental health counselors in the school, but from a community clinic.
Right.
When you do it that way, those people aren't getting the benefit of working in a school, but are getting all of the stress of working in a school. They don't get
Right.
the pension, they don't get the same health care, they don't get the same days off, they don't get anything. A lot of times, if there's a snow day, they have to go work at the clinic. And over the
Hmm.
summer, they have to go work at the clinic, or they're still expected to go see kids in the school, or
Right.
whatever it may be. And they're not getting that same level of support from peers either because they're treated like an outsider.
And a lot of the times, those programs that come into school aren't universal. So you have to meet certain criteria a lot of the time in order to even see those counselors,
Yeah,
which is super
you have to have
limiting
the
to a
right
lot of our kids.
insurance and other things. Yeah.
Hmm.
And my final question is, I'm just going to skip the third part because I already feel like I know the answer. My final question is, we've talked a lot about the things you would change about your job and a lot of the negative things that come with being a teacher and all the problems you guys face. But give me something you love about your job.
I love coming home and sitting down to dinner with Trev and just saying all of the incredibly witty, funny things my kids said to me that day, or talking about those kids who are really struggling with something and then suddenly they just got it. Or I had a kid recently whose dad was deployed and he was having a really tough time. And I could see it, but he wasn't openly saying anything. And I reached out to that kid and I was like, hey, do you need a hug? And he said, yes, actually, I do. I gave him a hug. He said, thank you. And then I moved on. I was like, hey, your counselor knows that you're having this issue if you ever want to go see him. And he thanked me. It's like those little wins in every single day that just make it, even though there's a lot that needs to be fixed and worked on, those little wins each day really make it worth it.
The moments of hope and empathy and things of that nature and true,
Because,
genuine
yeah,
connectedness.
because there's a lot of really great kids out there. I know that we like focus on those kids with behaviors, but there are some kids who are going to make the next generation incredible and they're going to do great things in life.
All right. Well, that sounds like a really good positive note to sign off on. Thank you so very much for coming on here, Chelsea. We certainly appreciate it. Cody just texted me and said you're doing a great job.
Oh, thank you.
Um, Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure and an honor. And we will see everybody next week. Now, I will preface, next week is a go. I believe the week after that is a go, but then we're probably going to take a 2-week hiatus for the holidays. It's just
Fair enough.
busy. So, just letting all our listeners know that. Outside of that, be sure to check out our website, be sure to check out our social medias, and have a wonderful, wonderful week. Goodbye.